Good day, and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Andrew Wu, and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Protecting Nature, Landscape Scale Conservation in the United States. The Yale Center for Business and the Environment is pleased to continue Nature's Returns, a webinar series that addresses the growing importance of ecosystem service valuation and investment. Each presentation is recorded and available on the Yale iTunes U channel. We are pleased to have Peter Howell with us today. Peter Howell serves as the Executive Vice President of Conservation Capital at the Open Space Institute. Previously, Howell was the Program Director for the Environment at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, where he oversaw the distribution of almost $100 million for land conservation in the United States. He also worked as a program officer at the Wallace Funds, directing an $18 million national initiative focused on creating and improving urban parks. Today, Howell will discuss his work at the Open Space Institute, a conservation organization that focuses on landscape-scale conservation throughout the eastern United States. Through recent projects spearheaded by OSI, Howell will illustrate the challenges and opportunities that landscape-scale conservation presents and share his insights on current trends regarding conservation in the United States. Before we begin the presentation, we would like to remind our listeners that questions are welcomed and will be directed to our speaker at the conclusion of the talk. You can type questions directly into the GoToMeeting chat window. And with that, we welcome Peter Howell to Nature's Returns.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in this gathering. OSI has a long association with Yale. We have several graduates of the college. Two of my colleagues, Abby Weinberg and Jennifer Melville, are graduates of the Forestry School. So it's my pleasure to be part of this illustrious community. I look forward to sharing insights about the topic, both from the work that I have done over the past 12 years here at OSI, as well as some insights from my earlier work on the other side of the aisle, working in the foundation community. So without further ado, our agenda, a little bit about us, then I really want to focus on two case studies that are very different in nature to illustrate some of the themes about the challenges, opportunities around large landscape conservation. I'd like to talk then a little bit about what the current context is, and to close with some reflections on current initiatives, including a number of interesting transactions, and then take questions and see if there's discussion. OSI, for those of you who don't know us briefly, we were founded in 1974. Our mission is to protect scenic, natural, historic landscapes, to provide public enjoyment, conserve habitat and working lands, and sustain communities. We employ a couple of strategies to achieve our mission, principally in New York, but increasingly elsewhere. We engage in direct acquisition of land and easements. Second, the program that I run focuses on providing funding both through loans and grants to help other land trusts and selected landscapes of the East to do their work. We fund and also conduct research on related issues around land conservation. Third, we support advocacy efforts principally around public funding in New York State and federally, and support efforts to engage grassroots environmental leaders and organizations here in New York. Where do we work? Principally in the eastern United States, our home where we've worked for 40 years and continue, New York State, principally in the Hudson Valley north of New York, but into the Catskills and up into the Adirondacks. We also work in selected states in New England, also a little bit in the central Appalachians, and increasingly in the southeast with a focus in the southern Appalachians, in particular in the southern Cumberlands and the Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee area, and on the coast of South Carolina. Our work in the East has included a number of elements. We've helped to protect about 110,000 acres, principally in New York, but most recently in South Carolina and in New Jersey. We've helped to facilitate the protection outside New York of about 2.2 million acres from Quebec to Alabama, and in the process have distributed about $110 million to regional, national, regional, and local land trusts through a mix of loans and grants. We do this in selected geographies through capital funds that include, that make grant and loan funds available. To date, we have about $30 million that we are playing with to distribute in these geographies. And importantly, to both establish our funds and to complement them, we conduct research and science on promising strategies to get to scale, and also support planning and research efforts that are complementary to land acquisition. There are two issues in particular that we are working on that I think rise to a landscape scale. One is our Resilient Landscape Initiative, which is a $12 million initiative capitalized by the Doris Duke Foundation. We work in selected geographies to provide capital support for land transactions to protect resilient habitat using science developed by Mark Anderson and his colleagues at the Nature Conservancy. And we're working principally in the Northeast to be expanded to the Southeast. And in the Delaware River watershed, the Delaware River Basin, a 14,000-mile area encompassing the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, we are engaged in similar pursuits, but to protect water quality through land protection and complementary support for research and planning and education. Geographically shown here, the sites that we're working in that some of you may know are in yellow in New England, and the one site in the Southern Cumberlands in the Southeast, with 2 more sites to be added in the coming months. Tonight, we are releasing the second round of our RFP program for capital and planning grants or catalyst grants in that blue area, the Delaware River Basin. That's essentially us. Let me pivot now to the concept of large landscape conservation. I think, as I won't belabor these points, I think that most people on the call are probably familiar with the fact that landscape scale conservation has become quite popular. It has taken really leaps forward in recent years, and propelling this change is the recognition within the science community of the importance of large-scale ecological processes, and that a purely species-based approach is not sufficient. I'll touch a little bit on some of this emerging science of ecological resiliency. Won't touch on it much, actually, but suffice it to say that with climate change, we're aware that larger is bigger and can facilitate wildlife adaptation on a warming planet. There's also a recognition that a regional scale is necessary to address the key drivers of habitat loss, including development, land use change, forest fragmentation, and invasive species. Finally, there's growing interest in the academic and policy community in large landscape conservation. The Fish and Wildlife Service's landscape conservation cooperatives are but one example of that landscape scale approach. Finally, as I'll touch on, and as we've learned in the Northern Forest, there is increased supply of private capital, although particularly investment capital that can be deployed for conservation at scale. One of the things that's most graphic to us and those of you in the land trust community is the increasing scale and scope of land trusts. We see it in this increasingly larger regional visions of land trusts in New England that are graphically illustrated on this map that shows the regional conservation partnerships. These have cropped up in New England. Highstead, a Connecticut-based organization with whom we work, has played a pivotal role in facilitating the growth of these RCPs. Today, there are 40 of these RCPs that cover about 60% of New England. They typically are aggregations of land trusts, communities, agencies, public agencies that are focused on regional priorities and are committed to collaborating to move beyond purely town or local priorities. And we've seen this in other parts of the country, but it's most graphically illustrated here in our own. But let me pivot to the 2 case studies that I wanted to share with you. And the first is in New York State, where we have worked, as I said, for 40 years. And the second will drive us further north into the Northern Forest. The Shawangunk Ridge is a globally rare ecosystem, an ecologically resilient landscape, and a recreational mecca. This is where Yves Chouinard began his climbing career in the 1950s, and where novice and expert climbers alike continue to flock. I'm indebted in the following slides to my colleague Bob Anderberg, an accomplished climber himself, who has translated his love for the region into one of OSI's most successful and enduring initiatives. And he's not done, as you'll see. This is the Shawangunk shown here in the inset map. OSI and our partners have been protecting land on this ridge for 3 decades, expanding and connecting the existing public lands shown in dark green here, principally state park and units. The ridge is part of an overall ridge and valley system that stretches down to the Kittatinny Ridge in Pennsylvania, up into the Highlands in Connecticut. It's a key link, really, in the overall Appalachian chain that stretches from southeastern Canada or Maine all the way down to Alabama. To date, OSI has protected almost 33,000 acres of land in 133 separate parcels, the majority along the ridge, the remainder of farmland in the valley. We've done this at a total cost of about $85 million. OSI, at the end of the day, will have left about $16 million of our own money in the ground. The remainder has been or will be recovered through sale of land to government, some private landowners, and contributions by philanthropy. OSI has often played a bridge role here, acquiring and holding land until public funding could be arranged. The land typically where it's been conveyed into public ownership is owned by the state. Several of our partners include local land trusts and the private Mohonk Preserve. We've doubled the size of the Mohonk State Preserve, people shown here walking on some of the carriage roads that are part of that park. We've added 11,000 acres to 7 different state forests. We've helped to create campsites and catalyze investment in existing declining park infrastructure. We're credited in large part, or in some part, to helping to stimulate visitation to some of the parks, including Minnewaska and Sam's Point and the private Mohonk Preserve. These units together account for about $15 million annually in direct revenue, and it's estimated that that has about a 2 to 3 multiplier more revenue that goes in indirectly into the local economy. So we've helped to expand some beautiful, breathtaking places like this, the Peterskill Conservation Area that we added to. At the same time, we've worked off the ridge. While our main focus has been the ridge, we've also realized the importance of protecting land in the valley to help channel development to more appropriate places and to preserve viewsheds and help maintain farming. Of the 32,000 acres protected to date, we preserved about 4,000 acres of farmland through outright purchases and easements. We've also leased some of this land for a farm incubator, a site of which is shown here to help new farmers get a foothold in the business. Over time, we've realized 3 major goals for our work, shown basically by some of these circles. The first is, obviously, we want to protect the entire 50-mile length of the Shawangunk Ridge that is shown here. We want to create a conservation corridor to the Catskills, which is can almost be created here through a land bridge. We also want to connect conservation that we've achieved here down to the town of New Paltz here. And many of our targets have included some of the areas right here where we've sought to buy buffers or additions in and around these existing lands. Going forward, we have a target of almost 4,100 acres, 25 different parcels that will achieve the goals as outlined in these circles. One of a big part of our work increasingly is to improve public access to these recreational resources that we've helped to create and to strengthen the amenity-based economy that they support. Shown here are a number of things. I just will want to illustrate one that's particularly visually appealing to look at and fun to walk across, and that's the Rosendale Trestle. This involved our helping to transfer the land on either side for creation of the walkway over this railroad trestle. It goes over the Hudson, actually. It's become an extraordinary community asset. It's facilitating increased economic activity through recreation and tourism. One of our biggest efforts, though, is in designing and enhancing the trail networks that exist in and around these priceless resources. And I want to direct your attention really over more to the right, where the oval that stretches into New Paltz. This is where one of the most exciting efforts that we're engaged in is taking place. Our vision is to create trails through the various preserved lands that are shown in green here, that will link New Paltz at the bottom here to the Mohonk Preserve in Minnewaska, shown up in the distance. A week ago, we groomed 8 miles of trails on land that we own here, and the local high school cross-country ski team began practicing there, along with others, helping to create a new constituency to conservation in this region. Of course, we're not sure how many more winters will be like this one, so we see this as a trail for biking and hiking, not just skiing. And thus, this landscape shown here has been one of the most important for OSI, and it's been one of our best examples of achieving scale. What are the lessons? First, we've protected this place incrementally through an aggregation process that is prototypical of how most regional land trusts work. And one can look at that and say, well, if we had more money, why couldn't we have done in 10 years what we should have been able to, what we've done in 30? And the question is, yes, the answer is that's possible, but time actually is essential to achieving credibility and integrating conservation with community goals. Good conservation often occurs in a stepwise fashion where you can learn from your successes and also your mistakes. Even with time to gain credibility, and even with staff rooted in the community as we have, we sometimes have been a target of criticism for people who think government shouldn't own land, or that a nonprofit is engaged in a land grab, and you get marked when you work at scale. If you work at postage stamp size conservation, you don't get marked. So we've been a target at places, and yet at the same time, some of what this aggregation has taught us is the importance of building relationships and building successive relationships with funders. This effort has been funded primarily by public agencies, though there's been growing philanthropic interest. There's been less opportunity for investors, and this will contrast with what I'll talk about in a little while, because there's little return on these landscapes as there are on forested landscapes. Of course, there is potential for compatible development, but the reputation risks there can be significant. So we've relied on creative bridge financing and PRIs to get our work done, but we've not partnered with investors per se. A final lesson has been that complementing our acquisition with a focus on trails and park development has actually increased the funding and constituency for our work and has broadened the base of support for what we do in this region. Let me turn to my second case study, which is getting to scale in a very different kind of geography, the northern forest. And I want to describe our work here over a decade, which is focused on supporting large landscape conservation and the lessons we've learned. We played a very different role here, that of re-grantor, lender, and researcher, as opposed to being a direct acquisition agent. Instead of investing our own money, we were critical in bringing other people's money, in this case, foundations outside New York, outside the region, into the northern forest. This is a region that, when you look at it in its entirety, is one of the largest intact broadleaf forests in the world. This area, including Canada, is about 58 million acres of temperate forest. It's a region of large, unfragmented blocks of forest land with moderate biodiversity. Much of it, though, in the U.S. has been cut over. It's second, and in some cases, third growth forests, though you can find some amazing tracts of old growth forest if you look for them. Vast expanses of forest land, a lot of it flat, as you see here in Maine, except for those iconic mountains, the whites, the Adirondacks, the greens, and of course, Katahdin. This is an area that has a fair amount of protection shown here in beige in Canada. These are crown lands, yet they are akin to BLM or Bureau of Land Management lands out west, where multiple use is permitted and sometimes there's significant extraction activity. On the U.S. side, though, with the exception of some of the mountainous areas I mentioned, there was significantly less protection. And this was one of the reasons that we were attracted to this region in 2001, the low level of protection. That, combined with the seismic change in forest land ownership that was just beginning to take place as large industrial timber landowners began to divest of their holdings. Millions of acres were poised to change hands, and this was a conservation opportunity that we sought to seize upon. The challenge, how to determine which were the most important lands to protect. We established a capital fund with $12 million to fund land and easements. Our goals initially were modest. We thought we would conserve 80,000 acres and leverage perhaps $40 million in other matching funds. After about 10 years, our successes far exceeded those. We helped to facilitate the protection of about 2 million acres of land. 80% of it was working forest, leveraged at least about $250 million in other matching funds, principally federal and state public funds, those significant philanthropic funds in Maine. We completed a number of signature transactions, I'll touch on one or two, and supported the development of several innovative financing tools, along with conducting research on issues such as forest fragmentation, working forest easements, and a financial analysis of Plum Creek's proposed development for the Moosehead Lake region in Maine. This is what the world looked like in 1997. Key protected lands centered around some of those iconic places I mentioned. This is what the world looked like after we were done through the support of about 23 projects through a mix of grants and loans. So you can see there was a significant amount of conservation that was added, particularly in Down East Lakes in this region here, also in northern New Hampshire and in western Maine, huge amounts of conservation. One of the places that was most interesting to see transformed was northern New Hampshire. This is an area with little conservation that had occurred north of the White Mountains in 1990. These are poor rural communities dependent on a timber economy that was largely declining. And there was also a strong suspicion of conservation, particularly from people coming from the south, as well as the north. Over time, you can see the change that occurred in this place. This is what the world looked like in 1990, dark green preserve, light green working forest. And shown in a time series, these are the forest blocks that were the target of some of TNC and others' work. And slowly, other preserve lands were added by 2001. Later on, more working forest lands were added. And these are more actually additional working forest lands and lands that were certified. That was another major development going on, improved forest management on lands, not just protecting them. And then the big protection happened up in northern New Hampshire, 4% of the state, through a project that I'll identify in a second. So one of the things that was showcased by this work that I think is relevant to our topic was the innovations in creative financing that have actually helped to guide transactions today that I'll touch on at the end. They roughly grouped into these categories of how to partner with private capital. There was a whole set of innovative deals that involved TIMOs or private timber investment organizations. There was all kinds of use of foundation program related investments, of loans, use of guarantees and letters of credit, even foundations helping to subsidize interest rates on bank debt to enable organizations to do big deals where they had to borrow. Even a debt for nature, declining mill, a landowner who owned a mill and owned land, and there was a swap that refinanced the debt in exchange for an easement placed on land. The use of new markets tax credits, which were tax credits that gave incentives or sweeteners for investors that invested in projects in poverty census tracts. At the time, land conservation with its public benefits around jobs qualified for those tax credits. There were 4 or 5 deals that actually used New Markets tax credits. I want to talk about just one project, Connecticut Lakes. This was the project that I showed you that covered 4% of northern New Hampshire. The Trust for Public Land bought this tract from IP, international paper, a while ago. It was 4%, 171,000 acres. TPL resold the land to state and private timberland investors. The land cost $33 million. The division public funds accounted for $13 million of it. The TIMO brought $12 million to the picture, and philanthropy, including our resources, paid for about $8 million. There were 5 other deals that we helped to support that include this structure. In essence, the dark green was preserved land that was purchased ultimately by the state of New Hampshire. The light green was the working forest lands that were owned, continued to be owned by Lion Timber, subject to an easement that was financed with a mix of public and private money. So in this instance, the money was marshaled by corralling the money from the timber investor and from the NGO and putting it all together. And the NGO worried about the preserved land and the easement, but the timber investor maintained ownership of that land. And this became an effective model. This was a very controversial at the outset because one had to navigate traditional interests such as hunting, fishing, snowmobiling, and some of that suspicion of conservation that I talked to you about at the outset. So what did we learn from our work in the Northern Forest? The Northern Forest was a great testing ground for many tools in large landscape conservation, for working out the science of cores, buffers, and preserves, from working out what a working forest easement and a large-scale working forest easement can really do, and how it would be monitored, how to mesh the work of the advocacy organizations that were finding the money for these deals with the land trusts that were actually doing them, and developing partnerships, some of which were rocky, with state and even the federal government. It also was a place to test theories about forest management. This is illustrated most graphically by TNC's purchase of land at the very outset of this phase of land buying of the St. John lands in northern Maine, where it bought these lands. It didn't really have much idea what it was doing and how to harvest them, but it learned a great deal from it. But more than anything, this was a laboratory for testing financial tools and practices, for the use of debt and the exploration of new equity instruments. And if anything, the question that we all asked was over and over again, what is the most effective way to partner with private capital? And what role could philanthropic capital play in that process? For example, when you team up with a TIMO, who makes the rules? How much can you ask the private capital to do? How much do you have to give up? If you recall the Connecticut Lake transaction, the TIMO owns the working forest, and your control is exercised through the easement. To own that working forest yourself would take a whole lot more money. A lot of us ask the question, could we become a TIMO? Could we form a green TIMO? How could you cut the TIMO out of the picture and buy land at even a much cheaper price? These are some of the lessons that we learned about our work in that region. But one of the things I want to touch on briefly, relevant to our discussion, the Northern Forest Protection Fund created many offshoots for OSI, including the development of a community forest fund and various research projects. But one of the main offshoots was our recognition of the importance of the larger region and the connection between the U.S. and Canada. We created a fund to focus specifically on protecting land in this transborder region. Our work actually built on analysis and science that had been conducted that showed key linkages between the U.S. and Canada. in all the work we did in northern New England and all the maps we made to look at those some 20 projects, we never once included anything about Canada. The map literally stopped at the Canadian border. And so we knew the country existed, but it wasn't until we began learning about the work of scientists that were engaged in a group called Two Countries, One Forest that we began to appreciate the relationship between two countries. The group developed a fair amount of analysis and mapping called the human footprint, and it highlighted key wildlife linkages where movement had either been documented or modeled between the two countries. In some instances, these were literal source-sink relationships, where an animal might be located in the U.S., but they were breeding in Canada, the lynx being one example. Out of this science and focused on these linkages, we determined that there was a need to bring the science down to ground and to help put tracks into these places through transactions that could show people what transborder conservation really meant. We created a fund, and some of the results to date are the following. We made about 30 grants totaling almost $2 million, evenly split between the two countries. So far, 19 projects have closed, protecting about 33,000 acres, and another 9 projects with about 22,000 acres are on the books. These collectively will leverage about $30 million principally in public, but some private money with a match of almost 8-9 to 1. And we are on track to actually protect about 55,000 acres. One of the places where we've had the most impact or have had is in the northern greens. And some of you who work in northern New England will recognize this region. This is a view looking basically from the U.S. border north into the Sutton Mountains, which are the Canadian equivalent of the greens. This is a region where we have supported a number of projects that try to build on plans in the U.S. and in Canada, and one of the things we've done is to convene groups working on both sides of the border to try to align those plans and those strategies and even the communication about them. One of the terrific projects, again, the linkage that is shown here in the northern greens, one of the terrific projects was conducted by the Trust for Public Land, a large tract shown in orange that connected conservation near the lands, the J State Forest, onto lands that have been conserved in Canada. And this was a project literally on the border that illustrated the importance of transborder conservation. In the following sequence, I'm going to illustrate the effect of some of the conservation that we've done in about a 6-7 year period. There's a few projects missing, but basically, as you scroll through this, you'll see the big brown tract is a 10,000 acre tract that we help to protect through a loan, and more land being added here. You can see over time there's a landscape scale impact that is being achieved. Altogether, we have, through grants and loans, helped to protect about 4,500 acres that have closed through the Transborder Fund. There have been another 13,000 acres that have been protected through a mix of grant and loans, and there's another 1,200 acres. In all, about 20,000 acres will have been protected over about an 8-year period in this area, helping to achieve some of the goals of plans in these places and to facilitate connectivity within the greens between the U.S. and Canada. I want to close with a couple of observations about 2 recent transactions. You are looking at part of some 60,000, 67,000 acres of working forests and preserved lands that were conserved in northern Wisconsin through an unusual collaboration between a timber investment management organization, a national conservation organization, and a public agency. And it was really yet another formulation of the private capital relationship that was explored and developed in the northern forest. In particular, this deal, historic by Wisconsin standards and really anybody else's, was a $17.3 million transaction, the second largest in the state of Wisconsin, to protect land right, as you can see, close to Lake Superior. And in this deal, our friend Lime Timber again bought 72,000 acres. So instead of the NGO buying it or buying some of it, the private timber organization bought all of the land for about $37 million, and they secured a loan of $16 million from the conservation fund, and they used $21 million of their own funds, Lime did. In exchange, the conservation fund secured an option to basically for an easement on about 68,000 of that, and to buy 2,000 acres in fee. So the option in return for exchange for giving Lime a preferential loan, the conservation fund secured an option that bought time, a year or so, for the state of Wisconsin to assemble all the money they needed to buy the easement on the 68,000 acres. This is an example of working in a creative way with the TIMO. In some ways, the TIMO has the upper hand here, as opposed to in the northern forest, a reflection perhaps of the diminished state of public funding that the NGO has access to. And yet, a conservation outcome, and a significant one at scale, was still secured through this innovative arrangement, where TCF used its concessionary capital, in this case, low-cost loan funds, to effect a significant conservation outcome. There's another deal that some of you, if there's any people from the West that are on this phone that will recognize, this may well be the most important transaction of our generation. This is certainly one of the biggest, and it is certainly one of the most significant in TNC's history. This is a $134 million deal to protect 165,000 acres of land in the Cascade Mountain Range of Washington and the Blackfoot River Valley in Montana, as you can see here. This essentially is being dubbed the checkerboard project. Again, for folks who know this, in the West, the checkerboard results from the granting of railroads land within 10 to 40 miles of a railroad right-of-way, while enabling the federal government to retain neighboring sections within that assemblage, with the result that you get this checkerboard that results in fragmentation, potential development, and has potentially harmful effects for ecological integrity in these national forests. 47,000 acres in the Yakima River headwaters in Washington on the left, 117,000 acres in the lower Blackfoot River watershed in Montana on the right. You're seeing a view of Ketchulus Lake and I-90 in the distance. This is a spectacular landscape that connects federal and state wilderness areas, encompasses the Yakima, which is a site for salmon and steelhead spawning, and it's within just a little more than an hour's drive of Seattle. Looking at the Swan Range and foothills leading up to the Wishart Ridge, that's the snowy ridge in the horizon. This is an area that's popular for recreation near Missoula, known for vast forests and trout rivers, and also ranching in some of the valleys. The terms of the deal are most interesting. TNC bought it outright for $134 million. The Weiss Foundation put up 90% of that money, $120 million, in the form of a preferred equity with a 4% dividend. So this is not a philanthropic investment. This is an investment, or a program investment. The remainder of the funding was secured through an $8 million PRI from the Packard Foundation and other philanthropic donations. Now, TNC doesn't know the exact disposition of all this land, though most will eventually be sold or transferred into public ownership. It will have to repay Weiss and Packard through revenues on sustainable timbering and revenue from other ecosystem services. This is an interesting deal, certainly. It showcases a new model for engaging private capital, TNC having secured it from an angel but an investor. It represents a considerable advance in the model that was developed in the Northern Forest, where we typically, or the groups there, had to rely on a more collaborative model, engaging side-by-side private capital. Here, TNC secured that capital and stepped up and now controls the land and can and has much more control over the disposition. Has a lot more risk because it has to manage the repayment of those loans and those investors. And so this is a challenging, highly challenging situation. But one of the things this deal does, and the note I want to end on, is that it does signal the opportunity for a new class of capital. Impact investments are the rage. They're the subject of panels, discussions, and conferences. The large investment banks are very interested in exploring ways. Reports have been released documenting the huge amount of capital that would like to be deployed into conservation and the environment for modest return. And the challenge now is to find deals. And that will be a challenge indeed, because a deal can absorb private capital only if it creates return. And return is created through timber harvesting, sale of carbon, or other revenues. And that creates challenges for conservation that can't always be achieved. And I think it's important to recognize both the huge opportunity this deal signals and also the challenges it represents. With that, I think I'll end and turn it back to you, Andrew.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Peter. We have some questions from the audience and colleagues that we would love your input on. So, as you know, the Open Space Institute's Conservation Finance Program provides grants and low-cost loans to small and medium-sized land trusts. The program provides a source of capital that a lot of fledgling land trusts would otherwise have difficulty acquiring. Yet at the same time, from a financial point of view, there's that inherent risk of lending capital to land trusts that don't have an established track record. How then does OSI balance considerations of risk with the conservation potential?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question because our goal is not necessarily to reach the smallest of the small, but we certainly see a niche for ourselves to help emerging and even regional land trusts. And indeed, the majority of our grants over the last 6 years have gone actually to mid-sized and even regional land trusts. To the risk question, yes, we make grants and invest in projects where there is a strong likelihood that they'll be completed. So the feasibility is a big part of our analysis. And we have to be assured that there's a reasonable likelihood that deals will get done. We have taken on more risk, making earlier commitments to land trusts and giving them, for example, time periods to assemble resources or to demonstrate that they're on track to receive public and non-private funding. So we are, I think, taking a little bit more risk on projects. We still want to see projects that come to us with a fair degree of planning, with a strong likelihood of being completed.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Cecilia from the audience. You touched on this in one of your case studies, but would you be able to give us a general idea of the level of returns that private investors expect from these investments?
Sure. Well, there's a huge range. I mentioned that the Weiss Foundation put up money asking for basically a 4% dividend, and that's fairly reasonable. I think you'll find some investors, individuals or foundations that will look to make loans of less than that. In particular, since with interest rates very, very low right now, and their fixed income investments yielding often less than 1%, investors may not be demanding too much. So the range really is, I think, between foundations that you can get to invest and make loans at sort of 1% to equity investments that could range more from 4 to 6 or 7%. But at 6 or 7%, that's pretty dear, and it really, it depends a lot on the asset class. There are some TMOs that were accustomed to making 8 and 12%, or even higher, 15%. Those returns have declined recently, just with overall declines in the asset class. So there's a really big range.
Wow, that's quite something. So during the presentation, you touched on the lessons learned from partnering with private institutions like TIMOs and the conservation compromises that arise from those partnerships. How realistic do you think it is for the creation of a green TIMO, as you mentioned, to serve that function? And would you consider the new model demonstrated by TNC and partners on the deal in Montana as filling this role?
I think it is in essence. I think TNC has finally surmounted that challenge we struggled with in the northern forest of the side by side and found a way with a very thanks to a big investor, it's found a way to actually create a version of the green TIMO. I want to say also that the Conservation Fund is to be credited. They also have a working forest fund, an internal fund that functions somewhat like a green TIMO. My sense is that these are versions of green TIMOs. They're not. The question of whether these organizations want to do it at the scale with the intensity that an actual TIMO does it, where they have a fund and they're putting money into 10 projects all over the country or in different parts of the world. In some ways, you have to work at scale with an investment fund to earn enough to justify fees and pay salaries and expenses. And my sense is that I don't think that either TNC or TCF wants to get into that business quite in that same way. And so this may be more of almost like a jury-rigged model or an experiment on its way toward some other final resolution. For those of you who know TNC, and there's hats off to TNC for this project, but they have created an entity called NatureVest that may have been the subject of an earlier webinar, or should be, as a vehicle to try to leverage increased investments for a series of projects. So it's not exactly a TIMO, it's a nonprofit, and it's more of a kind of a fundraising arm. But I guess the answer to your question, Andrew, is in effect, I think we do have versions of green TIMOs that these transactions illustrate.
That's quite encouraging. We'd like to move into the area of conservation and how it relates to climate change. As you move forward with pursuing land acquisition to create conservation corridors, how is your team considering challenges presented by climate change, ensuring that your projects contribute towards climate change resilience?
Well, it's topical, and I didn't show slides on it, and I could show a million slides on it. But our Resilient Landscape Initiative is focused on precisely that challenge, and we are, as I mentioned, utilizing science developed by TNC that identifies resilient landscapes, those that have the ability to facilitate wildlife adaptation as the climate warms and becomes wetter. The science is based on identifying places that are both complex, that have a diversity of landforms, elevational gradients, and connected. Places that are both complex and allow species to find refuge either up or down or sideways as things get warmer and wetter. And at the same time, they're big enough landscapes, they're connected and unfragmented that they can move through those complex landscapes. So thanks to this science, we've identified across the East, and our initial focus areas that I showed on one slide are a stab at identifying some initial places that could be good testing grounds for what it means to be a resilient landscape. There is also some interesting analysis we're mulling and that TNC is working on that looks at broader connectivity corridors between these resilient nodes that may be places that would facilitate large-scale movement, and we're working more on bringing that to ground and figuring out what that means. But I think climate change does pose a very significant challenge for land trusts, because we can't just protect the places that we think are resilient today or that have biodiversity today. We have to be thinking about where are those places that will retain or attract biodiversity tomorrow. And that is a huge first order question.
Um, Going into the interaction with communities, in your presentation, you highlighted the importance of building reputation and trust over extended periods of time. How do you balance this need, though, to establish credibility over time with the urgency to prevent development in key ecosystems?
Wow, it's a great question, because in an ideal world, you want to move at the speed at which development is moving, and yet sometimes that speed goes faster than the rate at which you can bring along communities. So that is the challenge. Now, typically, where development threats are really impinging upon you, that is often the place where, with effective outreach, you can mobilize the community. Communities get mobilized by development threats. So sometimes you can manage these processes simultaneously. One of the things that really the economic downturn, the real estate downturn since '09 has given us all in this community is a little breathing room. The developers are not knocking down our doors the way they were in '07 and '08. And the threat gives us the chance to think not just about necessity but about opportunity. And it gives us time to develop the support that we need for those transactions. So in some ways, I think the downturn has been one solution to the problem that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So for our last question for this session, I was wondering if you could talk about landscape scale conservation in other regions of the United States?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
are you familiar with other work being done in other areas? And if so, could you discuss the nuances between conservation efforts in different regions in terms of political climate, funding sources, or anything and everything?
Sure. One resource, and we could easily make it available to folks, and some probably have participated, is that there's an enormous amount of work being done in the academic community right now to chronicle and distill and synthesize the work across the country of various large landscape scale efforts. Conference in D.C. organized by Jim Levitt up at Harvard went a long way toward distilling that. There's material on the web. There's folks out at the University of Montana, Matt McKinney, who has done a terrific amount of work with this. Generally, the work distributes between landscape scale efforts focused in more rural places where biodiversity or large-scale recreational access of the sort the Gunks is an example, or you have various metropolitan, even urban landscape scale efforts, urban greenways, the Chicago wilderness being an example of that. So it's hard, I think it's hard to generalize, but a couple of quick observations. Some of the most successful landscape, well, the kind of the granddaddy of the effort is the Y-to-Y effort out west that is now 20, 25 years in its making, that proceeded with a plan that everybody thought was unimplementable, and has slowly implemented land protection really from Yellowstone all the way up through Canada into Alaska. And that is sort of the model for efforts around the country. A couple of quick observations. Successful efforts benefit from strong planning and incorporation of good science that can make a compelling and intellectually defensible argument, not just we've got to connect things for connecting's sake or protect things for protecting's sake. Second, process outreach to engage constituents and beneficiaries in those regions is another really, really essential component. Third, funding, being able to put things on the ground that can be the proof of concept and engage further funding. That's another really, really essential effort, as opposed to efforts that stay purely in a kind of planning or mapping mode. Those that actually put tracks on the ground and can show people what success looks like. Those strike me as three really powerful. A fourth, I would argue, and something we've realized in the Gunks, is that when you can connect the conservation work you're doing to other agendas, whether it be economic or recreational agendas, you gain so much more power and legitimacy. The Y-to-Y effort has even realized that. So to me, those are four components of success at the landscape scale When you ask me, where are successful efforts, I could go on and on. To me, one of the most successful is an old one in the Ace Basin. I think some of the efforts in New England that I touched on briefly, the regional conservation partnerships, at smaller scale, whether it's the Agamentis to the Sea or the Mount Quabbin to Cardigan effort. These are some ranging in size, very, very successful efforts, and there are many more.
Great. Those are great components to end on. And that concludes the talk on landscape scale conservation in the United States. Once again, we would like to thank Peter Howell for joining us today. If you wish to view a recording of this webinar, please visit the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website or access the recording through the Yale iTunes University podcast. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Andrew Wu from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.